I have been asked more than once to put the whole thing down on paper. The people who ask are usually young researchers mostly, or the occasional military historian pulling archival duty on the reclamation campaigns. They sit across from me with their recording rigs and their clean uniforms, and they want the Harrow Moon story. The real one, they say, not the official account. So here it is, the real one. My name is Ted Bronson. I was a frontier guide and contract scout for 11 years before Harrow Moon, and I have been a very different kind of man in the years since. I do not say that to be dramatic. I say it because you need to understand what kind of person walks into a story like this, and what kind of person, if he is very stubborn and very lucky, walks out. There's a version of frontier work that sounds romantic to people who have never done it. You are out past the edge of settled space, moving through terrain that has not been catalogued, finding things nobody has found before. The reality is mostly discomfort and logistics. You learn what the surveys missed. You learn how to read weather by the way fauna move, how to identify water by the smell of soil, how to tell the difference between a threat and an inconvenience before the distinction becomes costly. You carry more weight than you think you can, and you stop thinking about it. You come back. You do it again. The romance, if there is any, is very quiet and very private, and usually only visible in retrospect, from the far end of a career when your joints have started to keep records of everywhere you have been. I was hired on at Meridian Station in the spring of 41, third cycle. The job was straightforward on paper. Escort a private extraction team through the Harrow Lowlands to a set of survey coordinates, support their recovery operation, and bring them home. The team was small. 4 principals, 2 additional carriers, locals I knew from previous runs, good men named Duval and Soren. The principals were a company man named Rick Alston, who dressed too well for the jungle and carried himself like a man who had never once been wrong. A logistics operator named Harry Cullen, quiet and perpetually nervous in the particular way of men who know more than they're saying. A geologist called Marcel who sweated through everything and talked to himself when he thought nobody was listening. And the expedition leader, Marilyn Blanchard. I want to be careful how I describe Marilyn, because she is not the monster of this story, though she comes close. She was sharp-minded, relentless, and she wanted the gold deposits at those coordinates the way some people want to breathe, not from need exactly, but because stopping was something she had never learned to do. She had done this kind of run before, on other frontier worlds, and she had always come back with what she went after. She told me this on the first night in camp, while Rick slept and the others played cards by the thermal lamp. "You've run the Harrow Lowlands before," she said. It was not a question. "Twice," I said. "Anything unusual?" I thought about the second run, the way the fauna had pulled back from the southern ridge, the silence in places that should not have been silent, the light in a particular hour of the evening that had a quality I could not explain and had not tried to. "The South Shelf is different than the surveys show," I said. "I'd recommend we skirt the ridge and come in from the eastern draw." She studied me. "That adds 2 days." "Yes." She looked at the map a long moment, then folded it. "Eastern draw," she said. That is one thing I will say for Marilyn Blanchard. She listened when it mattered. She did not always act on what she heard, and she was capable of overriding good advice when the arithmetic of her own ambition dictated otherwise. But she was not a fool, and she did not pretend to know things she did not know. The rest of the time she was the most dangerous person in any room she occupied, and not because she was violent, though she was, when it served her. She was dangerous because she was patient. She could wait longer than you expected for exactly the opening she needed, and when it came, she did not hesitate. Rick thought he understood that about her and used it. He was wrong on both counts. Harry understood something about her that Rick did not. Harry stayed out of her way. We made the eastern draw in good time. The lowlands were green and heavy, the kind of jungle that feels like it is watching you, though on Harrow Moon that is not metaphor. The canopy there, a species of broad-leafed growth the surveyors had catalogued but not fully studied, responds to barometric shifts with a low subsonic pulse. You cannot hear it. You feel it in the back of your teeth, a vague pressure that makes your eyes want to water and your thoughts feel slightly displaced from their intended track, like a transmission with interference. I had learned to recognize it on my second run, and I had learned to ignore it, or at least to notice it without reacting, which is not the same thing but is close enough. The new people never quite managed that. Marcel got headaches that came and went without obvious cause. Harry went quiet and pale for hours at a stretch. Rick stopped talking, which was the one improvement the journey offered. Marilyn never showed it at all. Whether the subsonic pulse did not affect her the same way, or whether she felt it and simply declined to let it change her behavior, I could not say. Either explanation was consistent with what I knew of her. We moved through the draw on the third day. The terrain was difficult. Old root systems had lifted and fractured the ground over centuries, creating a broken landscape that required constant attention underfoot, and the canopy was dense enough that the light came through in columns rather than as general illumination, giving the whole passage the quality of moving through a cathedral that nobody had intended to build. Soren pointed out the tracks of something large that had moved through within the last day, well off our path. He noted it without alarm, the way an experienced man notes things that are not yet problems but should be remembered. We reached the outer survey marker on the fourth day. The coordinates placed us at the edge of a shallow basin, heavily forested, where a creek bed ran south toward a bluff. The geological survey had indicated mineral concentration in the bluff face, deep vein deposits that the company wanted assessed for commercial extraction. Standard work, or so we believed. Marilyn studied the bluff through field optics for a long time that evening. I watched her watch it. There was something in her posture during those minutes, a stillness that was not her usual patience, something underneath it, something that wanted. Harry saw it too. He glanced at me and then looked away. What none of us knew, what the survey had not captured, because the survey team had not stayed long enough to understand what they were seeing, was that the basin was occupied. Not by natives, though there were locals in the area, and I want to be precise about this. The people of the Harrow Basin had been living alongside what occupied that bluff for a very long time. They had built an entire framework of understanding around it. Ritual, hierarchy, warning signs, prohibited zones. They knew what it was, and they were not afraid of it in the way outsiders assumed they should be. They had a relationship with it, the way you have a relationship with something that is part of the landscape of your life and will outlast you and does not particularly care about your categories. They had words for it that our translators rendered approximately as the shaping ones, the resonance, the things that rewrite. None of those translations fully captured it, but the last one came closest. It described a behavior, not a nature. It told you what the thing did, which is always more useful than trying to describe what it is. We found the outpost on the fifth day. It was not built the way human structures are built. The exterior was organic, grown rather than constructed, if you can picture that. Walls of compressed biological material that had been guided into shape the way you might train a vine, except that the material was not plant matter, and the guiding had been done by something with intentions rather than by the slow accident of growing things. The surface had a faint translucency. In certain light, you could see internal structures moving slowly within the walls, like very slow circulation, and the color shifted in the low spectrum in ways that made you uncertain whether you were seeing it correctly. Not because the light was wrong, but because your visual processing system was trying to interpret something it had not been designed to interpret. The entrance was an arch roughly 2 meters high, asymmetrical. And there was no door. There had never been a door. Whatever occupied this place had not needed to keep anything out. Rick wanted to go in immediately. He used words like reconnaissance and assessment, and his voice had the particular quality of a man stating a decision as though it were a suggestion. I said we should establish camp first, observe, and make contact only if the site appeared uninhabited. Rick pointed out that he was the company representative, and the decision was not mine to make. Marilyn said we would camp. Rick absorbed this. He was good at absorbing things and storing them for later. It was one of his skills. There were 2 human figures in the outpost. The first we saw was a woman named Susan. I learned her full name later, Susan Gerard, who appeared at the entrance arch approximately 3 hours after we established camp. She was human, unambiguously, and she looked at us with an expression I recognized after a moment as relief so profound it had nearly broken through to the other side of something. She was thin. She had been there a long time. Her clothes were functional but worn past the point where the original fabric made much claim on the eye. She moved carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who had learned not to make sudden gestures near things that might react to them. She told us about her husband. She told us carefully, sitting across the camp lamp with a cup of water she held in both hands, and she chose her words the way you choose footing on bad ground. Not lying, not omitting, just making sure each piece landed in the right order so that the shape of the thing would be visible before she got to the parts that were hardest to hear. Dr. Roland Gerard had come to Harrow Moon 8 years earlier as part of a xenobiological research mission. The mission had been legitimate, initially. Gerard was a capable scientist, brilliant, by several accounts, though brilliance of that particular variety tends to curve back on itself eventually, to become a closed loop that feeds on its own conclusions. He had made contact with what occupied the bluff. He had established communication, which was in itself a remarkable achievement, the kind that should have been reported, documented, shared with an institution rather than kept. He had begun to understand what they were. The resonants, I will use that term because it is the least inaccurate, are a collective organism, or something functionally analogous to one. They do not have individual consciousness the way we understand it. They have nodes, concentrations of function, some of which operate with enough autonomy to interact with other species. The node Gerard had been working with, the one that had in some sense recruited him, was what the basin locals called Chaka, a name they had given to the primary contact node because it was the most consistent point of interface, the one that showed up reliably at the margin where the resonance's territory met human habitable space. Chaka did not look like anything. It was a concentration of the wall material, more dense than the rest, with a higher rate of internal circulation and a stronger output in the subsonic range. When you stood near it, you felt it in your skeleton. What the resonance wanted was a body, not in the crude sense, not a host. They wanted something more specific and more troubling. They wanted to understand why biological systems made decisions that contradicted their own survival probability. They had watched human behavior for a very long time. They had observed, and this is the part I have thought about most, in the years since, that humans, under sufficient stress, sometimes performed actions that served the group at direct cost to themselves. Sometimes they performed actions that served no clear strategic purpose, but were apparently connected to something they called loyalty, or something they called refusal. The resonance could not model this. It fell outside every predictive framework they had built. It was, to them, a flaw, a computational error in organic processing, the kind of systemic bug that should have been eliminated by evolutionary pressure long ago and yet persisted, and in some, populations appeared to strengthen rather than diminish under stress. They wanted to correct it. They wanted to build a human body that did not contain the error, that would function with the pure, clean logic they understood. A body that optimized without the interference of irrational attachment. An instrument they could direct without the instrument deciding, on its own authority, to do something different. Gerard had agreed to help them. Either he had been persuaded or coerced, or he had simply wanted to know what would happen. I am not certain which. And it may have been all three in proportions that shifted over 8 years until the original weights were unrecoverable. He had been running experiments for 6 years by the time we arrived. The resonance provided the biological modification capacity, the ability to alter tissue and nerve, and the deep architecture of the nervous system, in ways that human science could observe but not replicate. Girard provided the scientific framework and the test subjects. The test subjects had been locals. Volunteers, he told himself at first. Then not volunteers. Then he stopped using that word at all and found other words, the kind of words that a disciplined mind produces when it needs to continue doing something it can no longer justify by its earlier reasoning. Susan had tried to stop it. She had tried twice to get word out, once by disabling the outpost's jamming field and once by attempting to reach the basin settlement that lay 3 days northeast. Neither attempt had succeeded. The first had been detected before the signal completed. The second had been stopped by Gandor, one of the resonance's biological constructs, not a local, though it wore a shape that could be mistaken for one at a distance. Gandor was not hostile, exactly. It did not injure her. It simply returned her, without force and without hurry, the way you return a piece of equipment that has wandered from its designated area. After the second attempt, she had not tried again. Not because she had given up hope, she told us. Because she had decided that the only exit from this situation would come from outside, and that her function until that exit arrived was to learn everything she could about the outpost and the process, so that when someone came, she would be useful to them. 8 years. She had been preparing for us for 8 years without knowing we were coming. There was a chamber inside the outpost. I saw it later after everything. The walls of it were lined with what I can only describe as interface nodes, biological structures that protruded from the wall material at intervals, each one connected to a central mass in the ceiling that pulsed slowly in that subvisible spectrum. When an organism was placed in that chamber and exposed to the resonance's directed frequency, what Girard had come to call the treatment, its biology shifted. Not instantly. Over hours, sometimes days, depending on the subject. The nervous system was the primary target. The resonance worked inward from the peripheral system toward the central, altering the decision architecture at every level, trying to find and remove the specific structures that produced the irrational behaviors they had been studying. The problem, Susan told us, was that the pure of heart, her phrase, and I have turned it over in my mind many times since, wondering if she meant it literally, or if she had arrived at it after years of watching the process fail in predictable patterns. The pure of heart broke the treatment. Locals who had no particular malice in them, no deep selfish drive, no appetite that would give the resonance something to amplify and redirect. They transformed, yes. The body went through the biological change, but the change would not hold. The rewrite could not find what it needed to anchor itself. The process required a specific quality of human motivation as its foundation, and if that quality was absent, the architecture collapsed inward and the body reverted. The person came back, shaken and altered in ways that were subtle and lasting, but not what Girard had intended, not what the resonance needed. A person with genuine darkness in them was different. A person whose drive was deep and singular and specific, not cruelty. The resonance did not care about cruelty as such. Cruelty was a behavior, not a quality, but appetite, pure sustained appetite, the kind that had been running for years without diminishment, the kind that defined the person more completely than they likely understood themselves. That was the material the process required. The resonance used that drive as the engine of the rewrite. They amplified it and then redirected it. And in the redirection, the person's own deepest want became the instrument of their erasure. That was why Girard had been waiting, not for more locals. He had run through the possible candidates years ago, and the results had been consistent. The unsuitable reverted, the marginally suitable produced unstable constructs that lasted hours or days before collapsing, and the process had never reached the end state the resonance required. He was waiting for someone who came in from outside the basin, someone whose appetites were deep and specific and strong enough to give the resonance adequate purchase to complete what it had been trying to complete for 6 years. He had been waiting for someone, exactly like Marilyn Blanchard. She was taken on the 6th night. I do not say it that way to diminish her. Marilyn was not a woman who was easy to take. She had a sidearm she wore even sleeping, positioned so that her hand was within reach of it at rest, and she had instincts that had kept her alive on 4 frontier worlds and through situations that had not been kind to people with better equipment and more backup. But Gerard had watched us for 2 days from the monitoring systems of the outpost, and he understood what she was, and the resonance had capabilities we had not mapped. The sonic disruption they used, the concentrated version of the subsonic pulse, focused and amplified well beyond the ambient output of the canopy, dropped everyone in the camp within seconds. It was not painful. That was almost worse somehow. One moment I was awake, thinking about the route through the bluff access, and the next I was on the ground and the fire had burned down to coals and the night had shifted and Marilyn was gone. I came back first because I had more cumulative exposure to the ambient pulse and had built something like a partial tolerance without knowing it. The human body adapts to constant low-level inputs. It is one of our more reliable tendencies. By the time I could move, the arch was sealed, a thickening of the biological material across the entrance. Not a door but a densification, like scar tissue forming over an opening, and Marilyn was inside. Rick's first response was to pull out his communications unit and attempt to raise Meridian Station. When the jamming field blocked that, his second response was what I had expected it to be. He said we should call for extraction. Immediate departure, file a loss report with the company, classify the site and move on. He said it with the pragmatism of a man who has never personally paid for a pragmatic decision and does not expect to start. He said there was nothing that could be done. He said the site was clearly beyond the scope of the mission parameters. He was not wrong about that last part. I told him we were not going. He told me I was not in charge. I told him that was correct and that I was still not going. Harry looked at the arch. He looked at Rick. He looked at me. He made a decision in that interval that I think he had already been working toward since we left Meridian, the kind of slow decision that accumulates over days and only declares itself when it has to. He put his pack down and sat on it. Marcel said nothing. He was looking at the collapsed wall material at the arch edge, taking in details with the professional absorption of a man who processes stress by cataloging things. Duval and Soren said nothing either. They were watching me, and something in the way they watched told me they had already run the calculation and arrived at the same place I had. They were frontier men. They understood what you owed the people you came in with. Rick left at first light. He took one of the carriers, a man named Pryor who had his own arithmetic to run, the supply pack designated for the return journey, and his own pristine judgment about what constituted reasonable risk. I gave him no argument. Argument was not the issue. The issue was simple, and it was not going to change based on words. I found out later that he made it back to Meridian Station in 9 days. He filed a report that described the site as non-viable and the loss of personnel, as a result of indigenous hostility combined with geological instability. The report was thorough and internally consistent, and supported by sensor logs he had pulled before we arrived at the basin. He was that kind of man. He was believed initially, and the site was quarantined pending review, which under normal circumstances would have meant nobody went back for months. He did not know, when he left, that we were going to come back out and change his arithmetic entirely. I had 4 people left and no clear way into the outpost. Susan knew the outpost the way a prisoner knows a prison, not because she had planned to use the knowledge, but because the knowledge had accumulated anyway, deposited by 8 years of attention and patience, and the specific intelligence of someone who has decided that waiting is not the same as failing. She knew when the resonance nodes were active and when they entered something like dormancy. She knew the architecture of the chamber and the maintenance labs and the corridors between. She knew that Gerard monitored the process from an observation station to the left of the chamber entrance, and that he wore a kind of partial isolation during active treatment phases, not physical isolation, but attentional, the absorption of a scientist watching data, that made him slower to react to peripheral events. She also knew something Gerard did not know that he did not know. The treatment required the subject's active participation at the deepest level. Not consent. Consent had nothing to do with it, and was not a concept the resonance particularly had access to. What it required was that the subject's core drive remain intact and accessible throughout the rewrite. The resonance used that drive as the engine. They amplified it to the point where it was the dominant signal in the subject's neural architecture, and then they began redirecting it, replacing the object of the drive, what the person wanted, while leaving the intensity of the wanting intact. The drive became their instrument. If the drive collapsed, if the subject managed to suppress or redirect it internally, the rewrite lost its anchor and the process became unstable. Without the anchor, the amplification had nothing to hold itself to, and it would dissipate, and the biological changes already made would begin to reverse. What Susan was telling me, carefully, watching my face to make sure I understood the specific thing she was saying, and not a more comfortable version of it, was that Marilyn could fight it. Not physically. The physical fight had never been on the table. But the resonance was using Marilyn's own appetite as the instrument of her transformation, and if Marilyn could turn that appetite, focus it somewhere else, want something different with the same intensity she had always wanted the gold, or, more precisely, if she could insist that the wanting was hers and refuse to let it be used, then the process would lose its foundation. The problem was that I was being asked to walk into the chamber of something that rewrote biology and tell Marilyn Blanchard, one of the most relentlessly directed people I had ever met, to redirect herself. I had no guarantee that she could do it. I had no guarantee that she was still enough herself to hear me. I went anyway. That is not bravery. That is just the decision that was left when all the other decisions had been made or abandoned. What Susan described as the maintenance cycle, the period when the resonance nodes reduced their output while the central mass processed the previous cycle's data, lasted approximately 4 hours and occurred twice in every 32-hour day on Harrow Moon. We had missed the first window while gathering information. We had roughly 14 hours to prepare for the second. Duval had a resonance disruptor in the equipment pack, standard frontier kit, designed for dealing with certain local fauna that used bioelectric fields for territory marking and threat display. It was calibrated for short-range animal-size signatures. Against the resonance, it would be like throwing a pebble at a dam. But Susan thought it might be enough to disrupt the external sensors at the arch for 40 seconds, maybe 60, if we concentrated the pulse through the disruptor's focusing attachment and held it at point-blank range against the arch material. 40 seconds. I spent the 14 hours memorizing Susan's layout. She drew it in the dirt, corrected it, drew it again. The arch, the corridor beyond it, the slight leftward curve after 20 meters, the branching point where the maintenance labs were separated from the chamber corridor, the chamber itself, the position of the interface nodes, the location of the central mass. The angle from which Gerard would be observing during an active phase. I walked the layout in the dark between the trees, packing out the distances, building the map in my body rather than just my head. Soren timed me. By the 12th run, I was shaving seconds. Marcel spent the same hours doing something useful for the first time on the trip. He had been observing the outpost exterior at intervals, and he had identified a property of the wall material that Susan had noticed but not thought to systematize. The translucency shifted at the maintenance cycle threshold. The material darkened perceptibly when the internal node activity dropped below a certain level, a byproduct of the biological circulation slowing, he thought, the same way a body looks different when it is asleep than when it is awake. We would not need to guess at the timing. We would see it. Harry sat with Susan through most of the preparation. I do not know what they talked about. When I came near them once, they were simply quiet together, and that seemed to be what was needed. Soren asked me quietly, around the 15th hour, what I thought the actual odds were. I told him I had been in worse positions with worse preparation. He looked at the dirt map I had drawn again for reference and then looked at me. That's not an answer. No, I said, it's not. He nodded and was quiet a moment. Is she worth it, Blanchard? I thought about that honestly. I don't know, that's not why I'm going. Why then? Because she's in there and I came in with her, I said. And because whatever's in there is going to use her up and then look for the next one. And I'd rather it learn something about what we're like before it gets very far with that project. Soren considered this for a long time. Then he said, all right, in the voice of a man who has decided something and is not going to revisit it. The wall darkened at the end of the 15th hour. We moved. Duval hit the arch with the concentrated pulse from 3 centimeters out. The external sensors sputtered. I saw the faint luminescence around the arch edge go irregular, flickering, the biological material unable to process the interference, and I went through with Susan right behind me. Soren and Marcel held the exterior. My instructions to them had been simple, 20 minutes. If we were not out in 20 minutes, they were to go. No debate, no waiting, no heroic decisions. Go. I did not say it cruelly. I said it because it was the right instruction, and because men who understand the frontier understand that the alternative is 2 losses instead of 1. The corridor was exactly as Susan had drawn it. The walls gave off a low warmth, biological, metabolic, the warmth of something that was alive in a way I could sense but not articulate. The subsonic pressure was stronger inside, more concentrated, and it hit me in the chest and the back teeth with a force that was not quite pain but was adjacent to it. I breathed through it slowly and kept moving. The curve at 20 meters came where it was supposed to come. The branching point opened up ahead. I had 6 minutes of sensor disruption remaining, probably less. Left toward the labs, right toward the chamber. I went right. The chamber was larger than I had imagined from Susan's description, and the description had been precise. Some things do not scale correctly in the imagination. The ceiling rose 4 meters. The central mass a dense, slow-pulsing structure that occupied the upper third of the room and connected to the interface nodes along the walls through tendrils of the same biological material. Each tendril carrying something I could not see but could feel, a directed frequency, higher in intensity than the ambient, concentrated and aimed inward toward the platform at the center of the space. The color of the central mass was something I do not have a word for. Not bioluminescent, not metallic, not quite either of those. Something that the eye tried to process as both and then gave up and filed under other, and filed it there repeatedly every time you looked. The interface nodes were extended. They were active. The maintenance window was shorter than Susan had estimated, or I had taken longer than I thought, or both. I registered this and kept moving. Marilyn was on the platform. She was upright, not restrained, not physically secured. The resonance did not work through physical restraint. The nervous system disruption was sufficient, and the amplification of the subject's own drive created a kind of directed focus that was its own confinement. She was standing, eyes open, and the changes in her biology were already apparent in the posture, in the stillness of her, a stillness that was not human stillness. The musculature had shifted. The proportions were slightly wrong in a way that the eye registered without being able to name. But her face was still hers, still that hard-planed, calculating face, and her eyes tracked to me when I came through the chamber entrance. Something in them was still there, small and very deep, like light in a well, but there. Gerard was at his observation station to the left. He was a tall man, gray, wearing clothes that had been professional once, and were now the clothes of a man who had forgotten other people existed as a practical category. When I came through the entrance, he turned from his instruments, and his expression moved through surprise to something approaching contempt, the contempt of a man whose work is being interrupted by something he regards as categorically beneath it. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. His voice was calm. That was the worst of it somehow. "The process is at a critical integration point. Any disruption at this stage." "I need you to stop it," I said. "That's not possible. The resonance does not respond to." "Then tell me how to stop it." He looked at me with the pity of a man who has been certain of things for so long that he has forgotten uncertainty is a real condition. It cannot be stopped from outside. The subject's own drive must become incoherent. If the anchoring motivation fractures, the process collapses. But this subject, he looked at Marilyn with something that might have been admiration if it had been directed at a person. This subject's motivation is remarkable, consistent, extraordinarily stable across disruption attempts. The resonance has never had material like this to work with. In 8 years. I stopped listening to him and crossed the chamber to Marilyn. The subsonic pressure increased with every step. The nodes tracked my movement. I felt them track it. A shift in the frequency that was not directional sound but registered directionally anyway, like being watched by something that had more dimensions than your senses could account for. My vision narrowed at the edges. My legs felt wrong. I kept walking. There is a particular quality to moving through something that is trying to stop you without physically stopping you, a negotiation between your body's assessment of conditions and your decision to proceed anyway. I have been in cold water. I have been at high altitude without adequate preparation. This was different from both and not entirely unlike either. I stopped in front of her. Close, I could see her breathing or the approximation of breathing that the altered respiratory structure was producing. The rhythm was off slightly, the depth was wrong, but the motion was there. The chest rose and fell. The eyes looked at me. "Marilyn," I said. Her jaw worked. The effort of it was visible, a muscular effort, like watching someone lift something heavy, except the weight was internal. Whatever the resonance had done to her motor control, she was fighting it, had been fighting it in this specific way, the small specific way of trying to shape words, since before I entered the room. She had not given up the attempt. That told me what I needed to know. "The gold," she said. Her voice was wrong in a way that is hard to describe, not the pitch, not the accent, but the quality behind it, the way a voice sounds when it is coming from a place that has been changed. But underneath it, underneath the wrongness, her voice was there. The way she shaped the word, the weight she put on it. "The gold is real," I said. "It's in the bluff face, the eastern vein. Marcel confirmed the survey. It's everything the coordinates promised and more. It's there." Her eyes did not change. She already knew this. She had staked the entire expedition on knowing it. "But you're not going to get it," I said. "Not like this. Not as whatever they're making you into. Because whatever they're making you into doesn't want the gold. That's what they're building. That's the entire point of what they're doing to you. Something that doesn't want anything except what they tell it to want. They're taking your engine, and they're rewiring where it points." Something moved in her face, very small, very deep. "You want that gold," I said. "You have wanted it since before I met you. Through 4 frontier worlds and 100 bad calculations and every person you've burned to reach the next job. That wanting is yours. It's the most completely yours thing about you, and they are going to take it. They are taking it right now. When they're done, there will be something standing where you're standing that has your face and your strength and none of your want. And the gold will still be in the bluff and you will not care. You will not care about anything that isn't what they've pointed you at. And there will not be a Marilyn Blanchard anymore. There will just be a thing that used to be." She was breathing harder. The nodes along the walls shifted in their output. I felt it. Something in the frequency changed, a higher pitch, an acceleration, the process responding to the disruption, trying to compensate. The central mass pulsed more rapidly. I did not look away from her. "I'll be damned," she said. and the voice was more hers than it had been a moment ago, not because the wrongness had lessened, because something behind it was pushing forward. I do not know what she did. I cannot explain the mechanism, and I am not sure she could have explained it either, not in any language I have heard used for things that happen inside a person. But what Susan had told me proved correct in the specific way that mattered. The drive was the anchor, and the anchor was hers, and she had been holding it for 30-some years with the consistency that the resonance had identified as exceptional. That consistency was the thing they wanted, and it was also the thing that defeated them, because it was so thoroughly and completely and non-negotiably hers that she would not let it be used, not even when the thing using it was her own amplified wanting. Not even when the thing promising to fulfill it was offering exactly what she had spent her life pursuing. There are things you cannot take from a person by giving them what they want. That is something the resonance, for all its years of study, had not understood about us. The chamber changed. The nodes along the walls contracted, all of them simultaneously pulling back into the wall material. The central mass above us broke its rhythm, the pulsing went arrhythmic, irregular, the frequency scattering, and then the light spectrum shifted and the subsonic pressure broke. Not gradually, like a wave breaking on rock. It broke and went silent, and the silence was so complete and so sudden that it was louder than the pressure had been. Marilyn dropped. I caught her. She was heavy, the altered musculature, still present, still reverting, and I went down to one knee with her weight, got my footing and held. She was breathing in hard, deliberate gasps, the breathing of someone who has been underwater longer than is safe and has just found the surface. Her hands gripped my arm with strength that was not quite hers and not quite the construct the process had been building. Something in between, coming back. Gerard was at my shoulder. He had crossed the chamber and he was talking, and his voice had lost the calm of certainty and found the pitch of a man watching 8 years dissolve. He said things about data and integration and irreversible cascade failure in the node matrix. He said things about what I had done. He may have been right about some of it. I got Marilyn up. She could stand. The altered musculature was wrong enough that the movement was effortful and strange, like watching a familiar mechanism running on different tolerances, but she could stand and she could move. I put her arm over my shoulder and we went for the branching point. Gerard followed. At the branching point he grabbed my arm, the arm not carrying Marilyn, and he turned me toward him. His face was the face of a man who has committed himself fully to a thing and is watching it become nothing, and who has not yet processed what that means for the version of himself that was committed. He had not yet understood that he was the only one who had lost something in that chamber. The rest of us were finding our way back. You have no idea, he said, what you've done. 8 years. The resonance won't simply, this isn't recoverable, this kind of cascade failure, the node matrix. Marilyn reached across, took my sidearm from the holster without ceremony, leveled it at the ceiling of the corridor where it met the wall, and fired twice. The biological material rained down between us and Gerard. He staggered back, covering his face. We went left, toward the arch, and I did not look back. The arch material was no longer densified. Whether the disruption Duval had applied had continued to work, or whether the outpost's own internal cascade had cleared the external barriers as a secondary effect, I could not say. The opening was clear. We went through. Outside air hit me like cold water. The jungle, the green and the heat and the smell of soil and living things, the normal sounds of a world that was not building something terrible in its basement. Soren was 10 meters out, positioned with sightlines to the arch. Marcel was behind him. They did not say anything. They moved. We ran. The outpost did not explode. It did not burn. It collapsed inward over the next 20 minutes, the way a living thing collapses when it stops being alive. Not violently, not dramatically, but with a kind of settling, a return to a less organized state. The walls went translucent and then fully opaque, and then they went down, folding along their internal structure. the biological material losing whatever coherence the resonance's frequency had maintained in it. We watched it from the tree line, Marilyn sitting with her back against a root mass, her breathing slowing toward normal. She looked at her hands for a long time. Her hands were changing back as we watched, the musculature, the proportions, the texture of the skin at the knuckles returning, cell by cell, to what they had been. The resonance's work was undone by its own failure of foundation. Without the anchor, the structure had no reason to hold. "The gold," she said. "Still in the bluff," I said. She was quiet. She looked different than she had on any of the previous 5 days. Not injured, not diminished. Something else. The way a room looks when you remove something that has been in it so long it became part of the furniture, and you realize the room is larger than you thought. "I know what I wanted it for," she said. "All of it. All the jobs I know now." I did not ask. It was not my thing to ask, and she was not offering. "Doesn't change anything," she said. "No," I said, "probably not." She looked at the collapsed outpost. The settling had stopped. What remained was a low mound of biological material, already beginning the process of reverting to something less structured, less intentional, less like a thing that had been designed. "Gerard's still in there," she said. I looked at the mound. Nothing moved in it. "Yes," I said. She nodded once. She did not say anything else about it. We found the trail markers Duval had laid, and we moved north. Marilyn's body continued to normalize over the first 2 days. The residual changes the resonance had made were self-correcting without the sustaining frequency, reverting along the same pathways they had been built, though not as quickly as they had been constructed. Some of the strength the process had given her remained for a while, fatting gradually, like the warmth that stays in stone after the sun goes down. By the time we reached the ridge, she was moving at her own pace, no longer needing support. By the time we hit the eastern draw, she was walking point. She did not talk much. None of us did. The jungle asked for attention, and we gave it, and there was a quality to the silence between us that was not uncomfortable, the silence of people who have been through the same thing and do not need to review it in words. Susan walked beside Harry for most of the return. He was a gentle man, it turned out, underneath the nervousness, and gentle was what she needed in those days. She did not look back toward the basin. None of us did. We reached Meridian Station on the 11th day. Rick Alston had filed his report 9 days prior. When we walked in through the main terminal and the station personnel saw us, 6 people who were supposed to be a loss report, there was a moment of the kind that you remember not for what was said but for its shape. The way time slows when reality is revising itself. Several people stopped moving. Someone dropped something. Rick was at the transit desk, reviewing transfer manifests, and he looked up because the quality of the room changed. He saw Marilyn first. I will say this for him. He did not run. He was many things, Rick Alston, but he was not a coward in the physical sense. He stood and he absorbed it, the way he absorbed everything, calculating, already building the next version of the story, the one that could accommodate what he was seeing. Marilyn crossed the terminal floor toward him. The room gave way around her without anyone being asked to move. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a very long time. There are things I expected her to do in that moment. I had known her for 11 days, which was long enough to have opinions. She filed a report. That was what she did. She stepped around Rick Alston as though he were a post in the floor, went to the transit desk, identified herself to the station officer, and filed her arrival report with full party listing and precise coordinates for the site, including Gerard's status as confirmed casualty, in circumstances she described with the specificity of a professional who intends the record to be accurate. Then she asked about the next transport to Alcyon Station. The station officer told her it departed in 4 hours. She said she would be on it. I filed my own report separately, and I was honest in it. I did not editorialize. I gave coordinates, timeline, observations, and conclusions. I named the resonance as a Category 4 xenological threat and recommended immediate research division review and a quarantine perimeter that did not invite further exploratory missions by underprepared extraction teams. I do not know how much of it was acted on, or how quickly, or by whom. I know the site was flagged. What followed that flagging is not my story to tell. Rick Alston's account was reviewed against mine and Susan's and Soren's, and eventually found to be. The language they used was misleading in material particulars. What happened to him after that is also not my story. Susan Gerard spent 3 months at the Meridian Medical Facility, which she bore with the patience of someone for whom 3 months in a comfortable room with adequate food and people who meant her no harm was a significant improvement on her recent conditions. Then she left. I got a message from her once, 2 years later, 3 sentences. She was well. She was somewhere green. She was not going back. I got no message from Marilyn Blanchard. I did not expect one. I have thought many times about what she did in that chamber. I have had years to think about it, and I have not finished. The resonance was not a naive organism. It had been modifying biology since before human civilization had found its current shape, and it had chosen her specifically and deliberately because her drive was exceptional. The kind of clean, sustained appetite that does not waver under pressure, that does not dilute itself with doubt or redirect itself into sentiment. It had identified her as the ideal subject. It was correct about what she was. It was wrong about what that meant. What it could not account for, the error in its models that 8 years of work had not identified, was that a human being's self-interest can include the self itself, not just what the self wants. The self's insistence on being the one who wants it, the ownership of the wanting. Marilyn did not fight the resonance's amplification of her drive. She refused to let the drive be borrowed. She held it, and she held on to it being hers, which is a distinction that sounds small until you understand that the entire process depended on that distinction not mattering. They had built a perfect mechanism for exploiting human desire. What they did not understand, what none of their years of observation had allowed them to model, was that humans have a specific and irrational attachment to the experience of wanting things, separate from and sometimes stronger than the attachment to getting them. We want to be the ones who want. We do not willingly license our wanting to something else, even in exchange for the thing we want. That is not rational. It is not efficient. By any clean logic measure, it is exactly the kind of error the resonance was trying to correct. It is also why they lost. I was asked once by a young researcher who had read my report more carefully than most whether I thought the resonance would try again, whether the failure at Harrow Moon was an end or a pause. I told her I thought it was a pause, that it was regrouping, that somewhere in whatever served it as a long-term processing architecture, it was revising its models, looking for the variable it had failed to account for, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how to correct for it in the next attempt. She looked troubled by that. I told her that was the correct response. That comfort was not what the situation called for. The right answer to knowing that something like the resonance exists, patient, ancient, capable of things we can observe but not replicate, and interested in us in the specific way that a researcher is interested in a problem it has not yet solved, is not reassurance. It is the specific kind of alertness that does not switch off. The kind that a frontier scout carries, because the frontier does not care whether you are tired, or whether you have had enough, or whether you feel you have already paid your portion of the bill. I still carry it. Most nights it is simply wait. Some nights it is something else. A reminder that I came out of that chamber and Marilyn Blanchard came out of that chamber, and the resonance did not get what it came for. And the reason it did not is not complicated and is not the result of superior technology or better tactics or any advantage that can be trained and deployed. It is just that we are stubborn in ways that do not compute. I have decided over the years that this is enough. It will have to be.